morning, everyone, and welcome to the third day, and what I think I can confidently say is it should be the last day of this public inquiry. Just to confirm the ground that we have still yet to cover related to the provisions of the Section 106 agreement, and without prejudice, the content of any conditions should the appeal be successful, and that to be followed by the closings of the respective parties. Just a couple of matters on my list of things just to get to the bottom of before we come to discussions on those matters I've just set out. I think something discussed on the first day was confirmation of term dates. I think Councillor Smale confirmed that everyone will be back at the secondary school on the 22nd of April. Have we got confirmation that the Springfield Primary School is the same situation? Yes. Okay. Thank you. And just wanted to get an idea in terms of costs and any applications likely to be made. Is there a clearer position now from the respective parties as to?
Yeah, so there is a cost application. It's for the substance. It's a full application for a full award. It's the substance of the council's case. When you read it, you'll partly understand why. I know, and it's not lost on me that you would have preferred to have it earlier, but I take the view I needed to hear what the councillor and the councillors were saying, and you'll see that in the cost decision. So that's my explanation. It's in writing. It's only about 5 pages, and the view I take, but of course it's very much a matter for you, is that it's an important matter for the council, and so Mr. Richards should be given the time required to respond to it. It's I don't know how many cost applications you've seen, but it's not some long winding narrative of complaints about every stage of the process. It's just 5 pages aligned to 2 of the suggested points in the costs guidance. And so he must have the time he needs to reply. He doesn't need to reply today, and indeed your appeal decision doesn't need to be tied to the timing of the cost decision either, as you well know. So I'll hand it to my learned friend when I hand out the closing submissions for the appellant, and then obviously it's a matter for you and for him to suggest how long he needs to respond. Okay, thank you. Have you got any initial thoughts in response to that, Mr. Richards?
No, well, I'm grateful that we're going to be given time to, well, it's suggested that we be given time to respond. I should certainly have asked for it. We're about to have the bank holiday weekend, and I and some others are having some leave the week after Easter anyway, so we'll put our heads together and before we leave today ask you or suggest to you a time when we would be able to respond in writing, if that's okay.
Yes. I mean, my preference would have been for it all to be tied up today, but I accept that the situation would dictate that it's only reasonable to offer some time.
So would I, but we won't dwell on the departure from the best practice guidance because it will serve nobody any good, and we don't need to raise the temperature or our blood pressure over it.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. We'll come to that in due course. Is there anything else the parties want to raise at this point before we get into conditions in 106?
No, thanks, sir.
Okay.
Just to tell you that I am being reinforced. You already know by Mrs. Sarah Hodgkinson, because I said that on our opening, the DC team leader, but I also have behind me Mr. Ian Woodhead, who is the DC and Land Charges Manager. I then have behind them Mrs. Rosie Watson, who is the Implementation Team Leader.
Yeah.
And then I have Mr. Stephen Teasdale, who's moved to over there, who's the Planning and Highways Solicitor.
Planning and Highways.
So you'll be hearing from all of them as part of the conditions/106 session.
Okay. And that's a Stephen, S-T-P-H?
P-H.
Yeah.
Yeah. T-E-A-S-D-A-L-E.
Okay. Thank you. And while we're on names of representatives, if you could just confirm from your side, please, Mr. Young.
Yeah, so in my team, the people dealing with the conditions will be Gary Lees, who obviously you've heard from, Helen Dawkins, who
Yep.
And then the solicitor, please, if you could introduce yourself as well.
Alice from Cowlings.
Thank you.
And your job title.
Principal Associate.
Sorry, could you confirm the surname? Sorry, sir.
Hollis, H-O-L-L-I-S.
That's Sarah, S-A-R-A-H.
S-A-R-A-H, yeah.
Gowlings. Yeah, okay. Thank you. Is there any preference or logic as to whether we go through the conditions or the legal agreement first? Or in my hands?
Probably conditions.
Conditions? Yep, okay. So I'm using core document 8.14 as the starting point. That's the latest list I've seen anyway. I don't know if it has been, I don't think there's anything been circulated since. I'll just go through the list and stop on each one where I've got comments to start with, and then if anyone wants to raise anything on any other conditions or anything, come back to that after.
So just, if I may, we had discussions with local authority over the last day or so. We've made two suggested amendments to conditions 13 and 14. As a consequence of that, we've got a print-out version of the amended track changes on this. If that would assist you having that now.
It would, yeah. Yeah. Thank you. And I'll sign that reference 12.09. Okay. Perhaps ask you to talk me through them when we get to those conditions as we run through, but thank you. Okay, starting with condition 1, obviously the standard time frame of submission of reserved matters, and then the commencement of development. I've noted from Mr. Lees's proof, paragraph 5.34, that there was indication that tighter timeframes would be agreeable. Reserved matters submitted within 6 months and commencement within 18 months following the last approval of reserved matters. Is that still a commitment from your side that you'd be able to meet those dates if you were requested to?
It is. We can have instructions before I've got that in my essence. We have suggested that to the authority.
A couple of things on this. Obviously, that is following the guidance in paragraph 81 of the MPPF, probably the least known paragraph. I don't know of any local authority that's ever done it voluntarily. My clients have done it consistently for 10 years, not just this one, but other ones, because, of course, you're trying to fill the 5-year supply. This is the shortest time frame that I've ever seen a client accept, and the reasons for that are twofold. One, obviously, the scale of the site. It's very small at 90 dwellings, but also this is a house builder. You know, many of the clients are Gladmans and Richborough Estates and things like that. A house builder can just get on with it. In fact, they've already started to prepare the submission, so it'll go in if you grant planning permission very quickly. And that is going to mean the houses will get delivered before July 2029, which is of some significance now in planning.
Okay. If the council got any thoughts, please, on the suggestion by the appellant? No issues. Okay. Condition 4, just a small point. The start of the second page, there's a bracketed bit where it says herein referred to as reserved matters. Obviously, reserved matters already confirmed, clarified in condition 2. I think that probably needs to come out. No problem. No issues. And just sort of about accordance with details contained in delivering streets and places. I didn't know if the council could just confirm what that document is. I assume it's a council adopted document, is it? You wouldn't know the year of its adoption by any chance off the top of your head? Okay. Condition 5, I'm talking about the actual site access, and it talks about to an alignment as shown generally for indicative purposes on what would be the approved access plan. If it's an approved plan, it wouldn't be generally for indicative purposes, would it? Or am I wrong to consider that? I don't know if the parties have any thoughts.
Anything that says indicative is not obviously binding, and I think that's your point, isn't it? You know, you can't treat it as in any way tying the development to that drawing. There is a case called Crystal Properties. I only know about this because my opponent raised it last week, in which the developer, on an outline scheme, specifically said, this is the scheme, we want you to treat it, and it specified the floor space. It was a central London building in Westminster, and the number of floors. So it is possible for an appellant to submit it labelled as, you know, illustrative, and then say, no, we want you to determine that. But two things. It's on the facts of the case. That's an urban city site where there's very limited scope to do anything else. We're on a greenfield site with ample scope for variation. And secondly, we're not asking you to determine anything by way of floor space or anything like that. So it is purely indicative. We've identified... No, go on, sorry.
No, sorry to interrupt, Chris. I think the reason for the condition is just to put a base course in, binder course level. So this is to ensure that before all lorry movements are coming in and out, there's a the principle of the access is put in. So that might not necessarily be, you know, precisely as that. So I think that was the purpose of it, for it to go into binder course level, so that it would be finished off in due course. That's my understanding of it.
Do the council got any issues with showing generally for indicative purposes being included in the condition?
I'm sorry to be a pain, but I just want to be clear. I mean, just as soon as the word indicative is used, it suddenly sets the hairs on the back of my neck up, because it shouldn't really be there. Does the drawing itself say indicative on it? Can I just ask somebody to check that?
No.
Yeah.
I think we're happy to lose it.
Could I say that would be dealt with by virtue of simply the construction to a minimum of a binder course level? You don't need to deal with the alignment of that. The alignment will have to be in line with the plans anyway. So I just don't think you need anything after the word level. I don't think we need plans or anything to show where it will go. The council will ensure it goes in the right place.
Yeah.
Do you be content with that, council's perspective? Okay. I think that sounds logical. It's condition 8, just a minor point towards the end, where it talks about a remediation strategy should be submitted and approved in writing by the local planning authority. I think it should say prior to the commencement of development. Yeah. Okay. It's condition 12. It says there's reference to include hedgerow 7. There's no reference to what hedgerow 7 is, so I just would suggest it perhaps bracketed afterwards as depicted, or depicted as target note 25 on the phase 1 habitat plan contained within the submitted ecological appraisal.
Can you say that slowly, since you've obviously checked it and we haven't?
Depicted as target note 25 on the phase 1 habitat plan contained within the submitted ecological appraisal.
Thank you.
Now, condition 13 is obviously one of the ones that's been amended. I was going to ask the question as to whether it was actually required, given that we're at outline and all matters but access are reserved. Wouldn't the landscape condition be required at this point? But perhaps the parties have got thoughts or can explain the reasoning or the rationale behind the amendments that have been made and the ongoing need for the condition. We'll come to the appellant.
I mean, the condition is there, it's the council's condition. There's 2 points here. One is the principle of the condition, whether it's needed for landscape as reserved matters. This condition provides details as to what should be included in those details matters. The purpose of the amendment was to make clear that there are further works as part of the landscaping in terms of explaining what's required to be included. The other point to mention there, included beyond actual planting as such, it's details of green space, footpaths, cycleways, area. The other reason for including that links back to one of the provisions in the Section 106 agreement for amenity green space, and whether there is a requirement for that provision in the 106, if that can be provided for within the conditions. So again, we were looking to, the purpose of that was to seek to provide for that amenity green space through conditions that wouldn't then necessarily need, subject to your consideration, within the 106 to deal with that as well. The other final point of the amendment is we're looking to commit to an area that's going to be delivered as part of the planning evidence. I'm praying in aid of the benefit of the public open space and for its use over and above the requirement. This was obviously setting out not less than 1.5 hectares.
In terms of management and maintenance provisions for the amenity green space, is that still intended to be covered within the legal agreement?
Well, that's condition 14.
Oh, I've got to 14.
14 is seeking to deal with the management of both landscape and biodiversity, for landscaping and biodiversity purposes.
Okay. The council got any thoughts on condition 13, first of all?
Yeah, we had discussed it last night, sir, about the crossover, and including it as a condition instead of it being supplanted in the 106. So it generally meets with what we were discussing. It's just some detail in terms of reference to 1.5 hectares and 13, given that there is 2.2 indicated on the plan with the submission. So aside from that, we were working on, we looked at remodelling condition 13, but Mr. Leeds has re-engineered 13 and 14 to accommodate the bits and pieces we were looking at in terms of the overall management of those spaces and BNG.
And the 1.5 hectare figure, you're happy you've negotiated that, and that's your position?
Well, that's a number that we've just obviously been provided with. In the submission there was reference to 2 hectares. So, question mark over that element. But, sorry.
So I'll just make comment on why it says 1.5 hectares. The illustrative plans, the biodiversity net gain enhancement plan provided in the core documents. The illustrative comprehensive landscape master plan follows and relates to that. So the biodiversity areas and the amenity areas are combined. There's not a separate BNG area and a separate amenity area. It's all part of the open space. The biodiversity gains are provided from the delivery of all of the soft landscaping areas. We have a commitment as part of the buffer plan to not build on certain areas of the site. The reason why 1.5 is included and not 2.2 is when you get to reserve matters, you'll have to go out and look at that biodiversity net gain as part of the reserve matters and the detail associated with that. And if we commit to 2.2, we might not have enough to meet the on-site BNG requirement that we've set out in the BNG assessment. So we wanted to give ourselves a little bit of wriggle room as part of the reserve matters. The requirement in the SPD for amenity open space for 90 dwellings is 0.3 hectares. So it's 3,150 square metres for 90 dwellings. We're committing to at least 1.5 hectares. That was a significant increase, notwithstanding that we expect there'll be around 2 hectares. We just wanted to protect developers' position just in case at reserve matter stage there needed to be more open space areas to deliver.
Okay. Has the council got any further thoughts, or do you need a bit further time to think about it?
No, I think, as Mr. Lee's indicated, the possibly playing quantity is 3,150, so there is uplift. It was just that reference in the plan, so that clarification is fine.
Okay, thank you. Condition 14. Did you want to, Mr. Lees, want to just confirm? I know you touched on it already.
It was just to make sure that, so this deals with management, as it was written, it was to deal with the biodiversity management, just been expanded to deal with landscape and biodiversity management. So, as I explained earlier, the biodiversity areas cover all of the amenity areas. So this is to make sure that the management deals with both ecological and landscape aspects of the management. So that's how that has been amended. I've just repositioned the BNG requirement as criterion A, and the other criteria remain. And that condition deals with the management, ongoing management and implementation requirements of that open space. Yes, that it's not. Yeah, just looking at it now, there probably does need to be another provision in there to deal with the implementation. The implementation. Yeah.
Long-term implementation plans at the bottom.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's there. So the implementation and management regime for both landscape and biodiversity is thought to be covered by condition 14.
It says it criteria F, including a 30-year work plan capable of being rolled forward in perpetuity. Should there be a commitment for the landscape management in perpetuity rather than being capable of being rolled forward?
Perpetuity, I think, is agreed with, would be agreed with the.
I'm sure you know, means 30 years, rather than forever. That's what's required by the
Was
legislation.
is that in relation to biodiversity net gain?
Yeah.
I'm talking about the wider landscape amenity green space. Would that would sit separate, would it? In terms of...
I mean, legally, perpetuity in the context of, in this situation, I think is taken to mean 30 years. It doesn't sound like perpetuity, does it? But generally that's what's agreed. And that, as I understand it, is how the council interprets it as well.
It's for the lifetime of the development. So it'd be a management company set up.
Yeah. And there'll be an obligation on residents to contribute to that in perpetuity.
Yeah. So
Okay, yeah.
if we were drafting a will or something, perpetuity does, I think, mean less than forever.
Does there need to be any sort of distinction drawn between biodiversity net gain and the wider amenities? Are you just happy with lifetime of development perpetuity? The council got any further thoughts on condition 14?
No, it's fine. It's just a very small point on the fourth line. It should say shall and must combine both. Sure.
Thank you. Condition 17, it was one of the conditions I just earmarked for future discussion in terms of suggesting it might not be precise in terms of what improvement works are proposed to be to that particular section of the public right-of-way. Has there been given any thought to that from the parties?
Sorry, sir, I've just been passed a note about my microphone. This is conditions. 17. Yeah, 17. Yeah, we just. I mean, it'd just be useful to hear the council's clarification of the request for that. That'd be really helpful.
I was wondering, perhaps.
What are the improvement works? I think it's actually
Pass.
It's come up with the highways requirements.
What I was...
Surface the footpath, so I think you have to be...
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's I was going to say a scheme of works. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I didn't know whether there was any specific width or specification, but that could be agreed for a scheme of works, is that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously this is a condition, so the obligation's on my client to implement those works. Clearly we need to make sure that those works are on land where we're able to go on and implement those works. So it's not specified precisely where those improvement works are. If the land ownership provides for my client to go on and implement those works, that would just be my query.
These were discussions in the life of the application.
your highways.
So we need to refer back to the committee report. I think it was a scheme of works to be agreed.
If it's a scheme to be agreed, and for example it turned out that the landowner wouldn't give your client's consent, then that couldn't be part of the scheme, could it? I think
So a
that's
scheme to be agreed probably covers it then.
Yeah. Because it would be unreasonable to insist on a scheme that you couldn't comply with.
Yep.
Yeah,
Along with that.
Yeah. Scheme to be agreed.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, is there any merit in it, the conditions sort of taking a Grampian type form in terms of it being sort of off-site highway works, although it is footway
It's
works?
linked to occupation rather than commencement of development.
Wouldn't welcome a grampian when we're trying to deliver the houses and submit the reserve matters in 6 months. So
I think as it's worded now.
And the scheme will be agreed prior to the application of anyone. And in terms of the implementation, when will that be carried out? Again, so with the scheme to be agreed and the actual implementation of the work prior to occupation, both the same trigger point.
Or the scheme should include the timetable?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'd be happy with that.
For the scheme to include the timetable.
Yeah.
Okay. And I just wanted to check actually that those works, because I'm conscious there's a highways contribution secured through the legal agreement, which includes potential, well, as I've seen the last draft, includes potential improvements to cycling and pedestrian facilities. This improvement sits separate to that, is something that sits outside of the legal agreement, is that correct?
I understand,
Yeah. There's agreement on that.
They are separate requirements.
That was my understanding. Okay. And I can see you've added a couple of conditions. I think this is in relation to the, I think I referred to the last two conditions suggested by the Wildlife Trust in their response. I assume they've been taken from that said response, have they? Conditions 18 and 19. Oh, so there's a specific reference to swift bricks per dwelling, yeah.
They're taken from the Wildlife Trust comments in the application.
Okay. Thank you. Are there any other comments on conditions?
Yes, I have discovered that delivering streets and places
Oh, yes.
has on its front cover the date 2017, but was published in 2018.
Right.
Inevitably.
sounds like an LDS.
Yeah. But I think probably it'd be better to refer to the date on the front cover.
Yeah, 2017.
Yeah.
The manual for streets is 2007. I'll just...
If you say so.
Okay. Any further comments on that?
No, thank you.
So moving on to the 106, is there a revised draft on the basis of, or we sort of just through discussions so far in terms of how that's been amended?
So, yeah, the question is, has it been amended since the inspector last saw it? And I think the answer is yes. Yeah.
There was a scanning error in it. The issue that you raised on the first day in terms of the certification of part 1 and the lack of part 2 and 3, which is a scanning error, which we rectified and we went through it yesterday, didn't we, in both parties. I think I'm now happy with the
Okay, so that's the only amendment from the...
Yeah, it was purely stripping out the wrong part 1 and adding back in correct part 2 and 3, which is the same as the first draft.
Okay, and on the basis of what Mr. Lees was saying about, well, what we've discussed about the conditions and trying to avoid, I think, replication between conditions and the 106, and perhaps not a need for amenity green space to be included in the legal agreement, is that?
Yeah, as long as we are mindful of happy that everything that is in the 106 has been replicated in the amended conditions that we've just looked at, then yes, I'd be happy to take that.
Okay, and the major open space would stay in there as a contribution, is it?
Yeah, that's
Off-site contribution. Okay. Wait for the appellant if they've got any thoughts.
Yeah, just checking the amount of open space that we're providing, which the condition says is 1.5 hectares.
No less than, yeah.
Yeah, no less than. And in the evidence from my witness, it talks about 50%, and that's not 1.5. That's not 50% of the site. Okay. Yeah. So this is me negotiating with my client. So we're going to put 2%. Sorry, we're going to put. That's them negotiating with me. We're going to make that 2 hectares. That still isn't 50%, but it's more consistent with what Mr. Lee said in evidence. In reality, with the incidental bits of green space, it probably will be 50%, but what's important is that we represent to you and are committed in the condition something that's clear about how much we're doing it. So we're going to say 2 hectares of land.
So that's in condition 13, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah, and say 2 hectares. But because that is easily achievable, again, I'm just writing myself out of any future instructions.
And so on that basis, you're content with what's just discussed in terms of Schedule 4 related to amenity green space and the 106, both parts of that would come out of the legal agreement? Yeah.
Yeah, I understood that correctly, yeah.
Okay.
So 1.5 becomes 2.
Yes.
It does, and we just want to be consistent with what we've been saying at the inquiry.
Okay. Just other check in terms of the 106, other bits and pieces. I've been through a number of the things in discussions yesterday. Yeah, obviously, if we're removing a schedule, then it has implications in terms of the wording of little clauses here and there in terms of, 5 becomes 4 essentially, and let's just be careful, I guess, in terms of going through, systematically check everything is correct in terms of the different schedules. In terms of education, this is a point I think I picked up in the pre-inquiry note about the definitions of the schools and just looking at how contributions would be calculated, looking at capacity. So as I understand it, we're just looking at the capacity of those 2 specific schools when we come in to consider whether an education contribution is going to be required.
Yeah.
It's no wider than that.
No.
Okay. Is there just confirmation on I think there's a bit of a disconnect between the statement of common ground and the SIL statement from the council in terms of the current situation. I think one says there is capacity at the moment and one says there isn't. It says a bit of a state of flux. Is that where we're at?
So there is no capacity in the 2 catchment schools that we named in section 106. However, at the moment there is some although the catchment schools are full at the moment, should they come through the reserve matters right now, we wouldn't be seeking a section 106 date. There would be movement within that school place planning area.
That's different to what the 106, the 106 doesn't incorporate that flexibility, does it?
The seal charging schedule, the seal compliance statement talks about the school area and looking at the school area, the school placement making area. 106 just looks at the two schools.
Yeah, we couldn't widen that.
So that would be.
Yeah, so I deal with this a lot, and what happens is obviously people target particular schools they want to go to, but it's no good having schools that are empty or have spaces. You want the schools to be at capacity. So when there is capacity anywhere in that area, I appreciate you don't want to send people to the west side of Derby, but within a group of schools, then really you want to be utilising that, and you know that sounds like a great thing for the developer, but there is some capacity in that wider area. So yes, the Section 106 should be amended to reflect the schools that you're talking about, and then obviously, you know, it's then a case of each year people will be applying, and those that thought they were going to one school may find they're going to another, because the people from our development will generate places that are needed and will ideally go to the local school following all the criteria.
If they have admissions criteria based on distance from schools, which most do, then over the years, the system will work itself out, but people will go to the closest school because that's what they'll have priority. At the start, there might not be a space, but it works. These things work themselves out over the lifetime, over, you know, a few introductory years period. So
if the council are happy, if we could name all 8 schools that are in there, that's the answer.
Yeah. Well, is that something the council can do? Confirm which schools are in this?
Yeah,
schools are in the place,
Okay. And that would just need a change to the definition of each of the schools in the agreement. That would. Or are there any other changes that would need to be made to make that?
Yes. Yeah. Change the definition to include schools and then work through the rest.
Yeah. Well, there was one minor, if there were going to be amendments made anyway, there was just a pick up on a typo in terms of, I referred to Schedule 4 needing to be Schedule 5, and a couple of the clauses in the first part of the agreement is paragraph 5.1.1, it says Schedule 45, and it should be Schedule 5. Or it shall actually be Schedule 4 now, because we're removing what is Schedule 4. So, yeah. I wonder whether the potential for these things to get listened to.
All of the renumbering will have to be checked carefully. I'm sure it will be.
Is there any potential for this to be done today, for me to be able to look at, noting the potential?
Sorry, so could you just repeat the typo?
Yeah, so it's clause 5, paragraph 5.1.1, refers to Schedule 45.
We've made that amendment already. We've picked that up.
Oh, have you?
Yeah, we picked it up in the one that there's 5 rather than it should be 5.
Yeah, okay.
Before again.
Yeah. Okay.
We expect to ask you, would there be any chance of, because we're going to remove a whole schedule, aren't we? Would there be a chance of we expect to see that today, just so he can...
Yes,
he can
I'll still be with you. We can do it with the 2 solicitors here. We can do this today.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's probably worth just, so I can just have an eye over it before we close the inquiry. That would be useful. I was just going to ask for confirmation in terms of affordable housing. See, there is a definition in terms of affordable rented housing. Obviously, the provision is, or the commitment or requirement is for a mix of social rent and shared ownership. It's just confirmation as to why there's a definition of affordable rented housing in the agreement.
Yeah, it's because parties, basically to save us having to have deal variation further down the line. So if in the future we would want to agree to affordable rent, we've got the definitions in the 106 which then tie the correct elements into it. That's why it's there.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. And then, yeah, the other point we touched on yesterday about the transport contribution and it being flexible in terms of where that contribution can be allocated, cycling, pedestrian facilities, as well as contribution towards the bus service. I think we said, or Mr. Lee said yesterday, we were looking at potentially amending the wording in the 106 to ring fence money potentially for the bus service in line with the Highway Authority's request.
Yeah, we can agree with this. We would want the money to go, it's 180,000, as I understand it. Is that right?
Well, it's the calculation. The formula, if it's 90, would be around 180,000.
Yeah, and we think that should go specifically on the bus, which is obviously important for the occupants of this house. There are no detailed drawings of any footpath improvements or anything of that kind. So we don't know where they'd be required and so on. There are pavements, obviously, in our development that connect with the wider pavements. So we think it would be better for the money to go on the bus specifically.
Would there need to be any input or agreement from the Highway Authority to an amendment to the specific clause of the 106?
No, because... Oh, sorry, go on.
Okay.
Can I just explain why we've put some flexibility in there? So obviously we know that a key priority on this site is the bus service, and absolutely as council, that's what we would be wanting to target money at. That's why our highway guys put that into the consultation. All we've got is that 180,000 is not a huge amount when we're talking about bus service provision. So there is a risk that we cannot actually continue to support a bus service with only 180,000. It will require additional funding to be found, otherwise 180,000 is not going to last very long. So the flexibility there, in case we can't do that, because we can't find any additional funding to make bus service work, it allows us to still meet the objective of local planning and the SPD to encourage alternative modes of transport to minimise the impact of the traffic, of the development on the road, so that we might be able to then spend on some cycle ways, or footpaths. We don't know what those are right now because this is now an application. We don't know when the development will come forward, and we don't know exactly what the issues we would be able to address at the time. That's why we've added that flexibility in, although we know that the priority is the bus service.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to think it does go on the bus, and I, with the greatest respect, I'm not sure why the 180,000 would be turned down by the bus company, because it would be money to allow them to continue to operate their service. I don't know how long 180,000 buys you. You've got to pay for a driver, and you've got to pay for the admin behind the driver, and you've got to pay, obviously, for the continued maintenance of the bus. But the service has just been reintroduced, so I would have thought that the bus company would bite the hand off for that money, because it means they can continue a bus service on a subsidised route. We don't object to the flexibility, we just don't want it taken against us that, I mean, there's no argument about sustainability in this case, but don't want anybody saying, oh, well, you're too far and the bus service isn't, the long-term viability of the bus service isn't guaranteed. It's never guaranteed. And we want to help support it, in particular for the early stages when residents move in, they receive their information packs and there's a bus service, and who knows, the additional customers from our service may be relevant to how long it continues. So that's a very long way of saying yes, we're fine with it.
Would there be any potential for the wording to be amended to make it clear that as a priority or as a first instance, we look at the bus service and then sort of cascade down to...
Yeah. And as I said, I think it's inconceivable the bus company won't take the money. I mean, it's free money. Who doesn't want free money?
Okay. So again, you'll be looking to potentially look at some agreed wording today. Yeah. And yeah, I think the latest, in terms of the health contribution, I'm querying why it wasn't on a per unit basis. I think the last version of the agreement I've seen obviously had two versions of the particular schedule, but what are the versions it had committed to a change to the way it was calculated?
Now just in as a per unit contribution.
Okay. I don't think I need to go any further with that. And also just a query I raised, I think maybe on the eve of the inquiry, about the contribution rates. I think I'd seen the SPD or the latest schedule talk about sort of updating with indexation in terms of the amounts. I noticed there is an indexation clause in the agreement. Can I assume that that deals with any fluctuation?
What we do is we fix the amounts at the agreement of return stage, and then we index them. So if we then, because otherwise you constantly redraft, well, not constantly, but you then potentially have to redraft. So the value of the agreement, the contribution that we had at the agreement return stage, is maintained by the indexation.
Yeah. Okay. Are there any more comments on the 106? Okay. Should have an adjournment before closings. I don't know, does that need to be a longer time given what we've said about the 106, or is that going to go on in the background? I'm happy to be led by whatever you need.
Isabella's done a runner because she's off printing my closing.
There you go.
I know you wanted to be 30 minutes. It's a lot shorter than the 4 hours I sometimes do.
You don't have to read it all.
I don't have to read it all. No, it's much shorter, but it might be more than 30 minutes. And if I say nearer to an hour, then the solicitors, I think, have got plenty of time to do this morning before we leave at lunchtime.
Mine will be 30, 35. Yeah. 12 pages.
If we kicked off with you at 11:30, or do you,
Yeah.
and then
Do you need that time though? Is it that's 40 minutes away?
is that too?
I thought
11:15?
will be
11:15?
plenty.
Okay, all right.
Or we can even go a little earlier, I'm just wondering if you want a bit of time related to what we just discussed about the 106.
Well, I'm hoping there'll be concurrent activity.
Yeah. Okay. Should we say, let's have 20 minutes and we'll kick off with closings at 11:15?
Yeah.
15:15. Okay.
Thank you. Half an hour, you're an hour to the story. My car parking ticket's been cancelled.
I did a CPO against Barking, and the head of planning said, we'll get that sorted. And then when they lost the CPO, I was opposing it for the NHS, and they went down for £300,000 for costs. Strangely, they didn't want to pay my parking ticket. You're on the right side, though.
Is there nothing to add by the parties? Any before we move to closing submissions? Here. Okay. So I'll pass to Mr. Riches to deliver the council's closing submissions, which I've received in hard copy form, allocated the reference 12.10.
Yes, sir, and it'll be uploaded shortly. Yeah. So these then are the closing submissions on behalf of the local planning authority. The City Council remains satisfied that this appeal should be determined on the basis of the revised access arrangements and not that originally submitted and considered. The same applies to the new landscape buffer plan. Both have been subject to public consultation. No one would be prejudiced by so doing. The Council agrees with you, sir, that the main issue in this appeal is the effect of the proposed development on the function of the Spondon-Chadstone Green Wedge. The appeal site lies wholly within the Green Wedge, to which core strategy policy CP18 applies. Policy CP18 establishes a presumption against development other than the 7 categories listed in paragraph A. A development of up to 90 houses does not meet any of the listed criterion. Paragraphs B to J apply to development management decision-taking, either in accordance with paragraph A or where an exception is made to it. Paragraph K applies to development management decisions and or to plan making in the then anticipated Part 2 plan or in any neighbourhood plan. In terms of paragraph B, we submit that the appeal proposal does endanger the open and undeveloped nature of the appeal site in this part of the Green Wedge. It's not a small-scale proposal. It does not provide an opportunity to improve the remaining Green Wedge. The proposed development is contrary to CP18. That policy is the only one mentioned in the decision notice refusing planning permission, but it is fundamental. The proposed development is contrary to the development plan as a whole, as a result. Accordingly, planning permission should only be granted if material considerations indicate a result other than in accordance with the development plan. The presumption in favour of sustainable development at paragraph 11 of the NPPF is an important material consideration. It's common ground that the Council's housing land supply is only 3.85 years. It is therefore agreed that the tilted balance at paragraph 11D2 is engaged. Planning permission should be granted unless the adverse impacts of doing so would significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits. The only adverse impact mentioned in the decision notice is the harm to the Green Wedge. Nevertheless, this does not mean that this single harm is incapable of significantly and demonstrably outweighing multiple benefits, multiple types of benefit, as a matter of principle on the facts of a particular case. The outcome of a tilted balance exercise is axiomatically a matter of planning judgment for the decision taker, first the committee and now you, sir. In order to carry out the judgment correctly, it's vitally important to understand the history of green wedges in Derby, why they have been regarded as being so important to generations of its citizens, and how necessary new greenfield development should be accommodated in and around the urban area of Derby. There is ordinary countryside to the south and west of the urban area. To the north and east is Greenbelt. Penetrating into the city from the countryside, whether from the green belt or not, are the 13 green wedges. They are spread around the clock face of the city. They are part of the established fabric of the city and highly valued and jealously guarded by citizens and their elected representatives, and are protected by policy CP18. They are reviewed as part of plan making. The appellant has noted that Greenbelt policy protection has been relaxed recently with the introduction of the grey belt concept. The appellant came close to asserting that its site, that should be SITE, was in reality grey wedge, but no such concept exists, and its introduction would have to await the plan-making process. The last green wedge review was in 2012, which recognised the new context of the then recently published NPPF. It was a comprehensive study that assessed sites being promoted for development, but also identified where housing development was otherwise possible. It did so because the authors well understood the groundbreaking nature of the NPPF and the need to significantly boost the supply of land for housing. Each of the 13 green wedges was looked at in turn. In all, land was identified that could potentially accommodate about 2,000 houses, subject to further analysis of non-green wedge issues. In the Spondon-Chaddesden green wedge, no sites were identified as being suitable for allocation. Only one site was recorded as being promoted. The appeal site was not. The only land uses noted were existing public open space local nature reserve and a future site for public open space. The conclusions were, and I set them out, the final one of which I have emphasised, is this green wedge is not considered to have any potential capacity for new development from a green wedge perspective. The Green Wedge Review was considered by the Acorn Way inspector in April 2016. He was considering that appeal against the previous version of the Green Wedge policy in the City of Derby Local Plan Review 2006, which was essentially the same as it is now. He set out a helpful history and background to green wedges in Derby, including an analysis of the 1998 and 2005 local plan inspectors' reports. And overall, the inspector concluded, taking all those matters into account, I consider that Derby's green wedges serve an important planning function in maintaining the different character and identity of the suburbs and enhancing the urban form and structure of the city. They are integral to the character and distinctiveness of the place, so that their supporting policies, both long established in the form of Saved Policy E2 and emerging in relation to Policy CP18, are potentially consistent with elements of the core principles and a raft of the advice set out in the framework. We say this assessment and conclusions are fully supported by those of the core strategy inspector in December 2016. And we submit that these conclusions are equally valid today. The importance and integral nature of the green wedges do not diminish with the passing of time. They still provide the same psychological and physical break between Chaddesden and Spondon. The Green Wedge Review of 2012 was, of course, part of the evidence base for the core strategy. As already noted, it identified land with potential in green wedge terms for about 2,000 houses to be released from the green wedges. This was in the context that there would be unmet need to be exported to neighbouring local planning authorities. This was found to be sound. The local plan inspector said it was justified, but the local plan did not provide for more than a minimum of 11,000 houses. Adopted in 2017, the plan is predicated on delivering 11,000 dwellings over the plan period out of an assessed need of 1,388, the remainder being exported elsewhere in the HMA. The need was therefore for an average of 964 dwellings per year over the plan period, although the plan's requirement was for 647. During the time of the 35% uplift, it rose to 1,244. It's now 906 dwellings a year, based on the standard method, following its update in December 2024. That is 58 dwellings a year less than the need underpinning the core strategy. The Acorn Way inspector found that the concept of green wedges are consistent with the NPPF, and that remains the case today. It means that in accordance with the first part of NPPF Para 232, CP18 can be given full weight for consistency. The Statement of Common Ground at paragraph 8.6 includes policy CP18 in the section on out-of-date policies on the basis that it's agreed that the green wedge designation contained within policy CP18 does not offer protection from the tilted balance as per NPPF footnote 7 to paragraph 11D. That does not really make it out of date in the sense it should receive less weight for being inconsistent with the framework. It is, of course, one of the basket of most important policies for determining the appeal, which are deemed to be out of date by virtue of the lack of a 5-year housing land supply. Section 11 of the Statement of Common Ground explains the difference. The appellant avers that CP18 ought to contain an internal mechanism for balancing harms and benefits, as does the NPPF. But the local plan needs to be read as a whole. Policy CP1A does that. The Acorn Way inspector also considered whether the Spondon-Chadstone green wedge fulfilled the function of green wedges in general. He finds that it does, consistent with the views of previous inspectors. What then of the contribution of the appeal site to the functioning of this green wedge? First, it is close to the narrowest part of the green wedge. Second, the remaining gap would be of the same order of magnitude as that at West Road. The narrowing caused by the spur of development either side of West Road would be reinforced northwards by development on the appeal site. South of West Road, the actual gap between built form is already equivalent as a result of the school buildings inside the green wedge. The appellant's witness, Catherine Ellinsfield, has carried out her own green wedge review, in which she draws comfort from the following. The most elevated parts of the appeal site would remain undeveloped, but this is not really relevant to a spatial designation. The green wedge is not a landscape designation. The appeal site does not extend further west than the existing development on or off West Road. However, it simply reinforces the narrower nature of the green wedge at this general location. It also adds to the sense of sprawl from the edge of Spondon into the green wedge. Next, she says, the appeal scheme does not encroach upon the area of public open space proposed north of the nature reserve and west of the primary school. That is true, but it does nothing to bring forward any of the proposed public open space either. Next, the appeal site is not in agricultural use. It's used for the keeping of horses. But we say it could revert to agriculture at any time at the whim of the owner. Horticulture is a countryside use, and the land retains an open character. Next, she says the appeal site is not on the axis of the green wedge. Now, it is the case that in the methodology at para 5.8, the axis of each green wedge is defined as the most sensitive part, and that development in close proximity to the axis would have a greater impact upon the role and function of the green wedge. But that does not mean that development of the sites on the edge would have no impact. In other green wedges, the authors of the Green Wedge Review have noted those parts where there is potential for change, and there is none indicated in the Spondon-Chadstone green wedge, or on the appeal site in particular. In Table 6, she divides the green wedge into 3 sections, and then into area parcels shown on the plan at Appendix 1. Once again, high, medium, and low assessed contributions are all relative. They could equally have been medium, high, and very high. Where land parcels could be developed without undue harm to the green wedge, they were identified in the Green Wedge Review. At the inquiry, 2 further concepts were developed. First, development in all 4 directions. It's quite clear, that should be, not cleat, it's not an American football boot. It's quite clear that to the east there is housing development. That is true of pretty much all of the west, east, and south sides of the green wedge. To the south of the appeal site is the school, but the school buildings and the appeal site will be separated by a wood and a field. So this side of the appeal site is undeveloped land. To the north of a building, which is a piece of water-related concrete infrastructure, sitting in the middle of an open compound. To the west are the buildings of Brookfield Farm. None of these buildings have an effect of narrowing the green wedge or the perception of bringing Spondon and Chadstone closer together. The appeal scheme can gain no comfort at all from the four directions concept, yet it was described as being a key part of our case, and that the appeal site was, in reality, located in built countryside. We respectfully disagree and rely on your assessment, sir, during your site visit. The second concept is scruffy land. The scruffiness of the appeal site, or otherwise, will have been assessed on site. In this context, it's noteworthy that the Acorn Way inspector was faced with the suggestion that that site, that's the Acorn Way site, was unkempt. He said, "I agree that the appeal site does not fulfil all the functions that might be attributed to land in a green wedge. It's not in agricultural use, although it has been used for agriculture within the last decade or so, and it is unkempt. But I do not agree that such circumstances warrant this scheme. Whether or not alternatives might be feasible, developing a site in a green wedge because it is unkempt could, all too easily, set a precedent that ought to be avoided." In the overall planning balance, weighing harms and benefits, the Acorn Way inspector was at pains to point out the nature of the harm to the green wedge. He said such damage would be irreparable. Moreover, it would undermine a key element in the form and character of the city that has not only been long established, but has also been supported by long established statutory planning policies. Hence, I consider such harmful effects to be very damaging. And he added, there would be serious and lasting damage to the long-established social and environmental objective, supported by statutory planning policies, to enhance the urban form and character of the city with green wedges. In my view, the irreparable harm to the policy objective would not be outweighed by the provision of jobs, the spending power of new residents, a new homes bonus, or the required mitigation achieved through the Section 106 agreement. We submit that there would be similar, long-lasting, irreparable harm caused by the proposed development in this appeal. In the next round of plan making, the question of identifying development parcels in green wedges and green belt of Derby will arise again. Once more, plan makers will have to decide whether the city can or should meet all its housing need within boundaries. To that end, officers of the city and its neighbouring authorities have been cooperating over housing land capacity. The result is a position paper, and the position paper notes that the cooperation in the last round of plan making led to an agreed position that 5,388 dwellings of an objectively assessed need of 16,388 would be provided for in Amber Valley and South Derbyshire. Secondly, it records discussions that led to a work stream to identify potential residential land capacity in Derby for the next plan period, initially 18 years from 2021 to 2039, and therefore to identify any likely shortfall. The paper does not identify individual sites in the capacity identified. A number of typologies were looked at, including green wedge and green belt. As the high-level study advanced, the capacity identified was, firstly, 11,900 to 13,600, with the upper end requiring release of more green wedge and some green belt land. These outputs were shared with partner local planning authorities. Unsurprisingly, Derby was asked to arrange for an independent review. ACOM were appointed, including check and challenge sessions with the partner local planning authorities. ACOM's review was delivered in January 2023. It found the city's figures to be robust, but recommended a more realistic figure of 10,400. The city did not support this lower figure. In ongoing work with the local planning authority partners, it was more ambitious. In March 2023, capacity update was for a figure of 12,041 in the 17 years to 2039. The June 2023 figure, following further review, was 12,361 over a 17-year plan period, which was rounded up to 12,500 in the July report to the HMI Joint Advisory Board. The May 2024 update was 12,247 over a 17-year plan period. And in July 2024, the HMA partners agreed that their respective plans should progress on the basis that Derby City Council's capacity is capped at 12,500, as agreed by the Joint Advisory Board. How that 12,500 is made up is shown in Appendix 3 to the paper. 615 dwellings from Green Wedge releases and none shown from the Green Belt. None of the Green Wedge release sites have been identified. The work has not been subject to sustainability appraisal or strategic environmental assessment, nor to public consultation. So as noted in opening, the stakeholders in the city are already thinking about the following dilemma. Should we build over the Green Wedge to put a brake on outwards expansion, including into the Green Belt? Or should the city continue to expand outwards where it needs to, while respecting and maintaining green wedges, as has been done for many, many years? Councillor Holmes is of the clear view that any further erosion of the green wedge, on top of that identified in the last round of plan making, should be carried out in the local plan process, given the importance of the green wedges to Derby. He's willing to consider green belt releases ahead of green wedge. But it's plain that while the position paper posits 615 dwellings in the green wedge, that is not going to be the end of the matter. The Reg 18 consultation at the end of 2025, or earlier if the evidence base is published in advance, will likely give us the answer. It's been suggested that the February 2025 LDS timetable is unrealistic. This is not a plan under the new regime postulated by the government in its consultation response to the recent NPPF revision, for which the regulations and guidance have yet to be published. The City Council anticipates a plan being brought forward and examined under the current regime, but there will be a sense of urgency to get it through. Be that as it may, the main issue in this appeal is the outcome of the tilted planning balance. What considerations fall to be weighed on either side of the balance are not really in dispute, as at the end of the inquiry. The City Council, through its officers in the officer report to committee, and by Councillor Holmes in his proof of evidence, have given due weight to the benefits of granting permission for up to 90 houses, including 30% affordable on the appeal side. The acknowledged benefits are increasing housing supply, very significant weight. The Housing Statement of Common Ground records the undersupply is 1,251 dwellings. 30% affordable housing, that'll be up to 27 homes. Once again, this merits very significant weight. BNG, 11.31% net gain for habitats, 32.25% net gain for hedgerows, and a 78.09% net gain for watercourse. The net gains achievable significantly exceeds the current local plan requirement, Policy CP19 Biodiversity, which requires a net gain only, and it is therefore agreed to be a benefit of the scheme. Next, on-site public open space will be accessible to off-site residents. And there will be economic benefits, construction and post-construction, as set out in the appellant's infographic. The following matters also set out in the Statement of Common Ground are neutral in the planning balance, subject to conditions and obligations. Locational sustainability, access to services and non-car modes. Ecological impact, that's protected species and habitats. Designated and non-designated heritage asset impact. Air quality, noise and light pollution. Arboricultural impact. Highway safety and capacity impact. Landscape and visual impact. Flood risk and drainage. For the Council and Councillor Holmes, the harm to the green wedge is very substantial and irreparable. The appellant seems content that there will be some left on the west side of the current wedge. That approach simply does not respect the importance and value of Derby's green wedges. The harm does indeed significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits. There is therefore no material consideration sufficient to outweigh the development plan indication that the appeal should be dismissed. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Richards. Mr. Young, do you need any? Need straight in.
that's great.
Yeah.
It was sent before discussion started.
Okay. We'll come to you when it's circulated. Yeah. Thank you.
Paul Tucker and I did a case recently, and I was for the local authority, and we both did 4-hour closings. 4 hours. But because England were playing, we both agreed to take an hour off, not read an hour's worth, and everybody got home to watch the match. Right, the appellant's closing statement. This is an appeal against the local planning authority's refusal to grant planning permission for the appellant's proposal for outline planning permission for up to 90 dwellings with 30% affordable housing, the proposal. Starting then with the development plan, planning decisions should be determined in accordance with the development plan. The development plan must be up to date as required by the NPPF. See paragraphs 11, 12 and 15. This LPA has no up-to-date development plan. It adopted a part of a plan in 2017, the core strategy, but it failed to produce the Part 2 plan, which the core strategy planning inspector was promised would be adopted by December 2017. That Part 2 plan was to provide smaller allocations and a suite of development management policies. A review of the green wedges to help identify and deliver those sites was promised. None of that happened. The core strategy inspector was misled by the council, but he was not just misled about it being adopted in 2017. He was totally misled on the subject because over 7 years later, the Part 2 plan has never been adopted. The council then promised in 2021 it would produce a new plan, but that never happened either. So when Councillor Holmes tells us he has every confidence there will be a new plan adopted soon, he is the only one in the room who does. I'm afraid nobody believes him. There is absolutely no credibility in that statement. Derby City Council is a persistent offender when it comes to failing to do what it says it does. And as Mr. Lee explained, they find it too difficult politically. The core strategy is not a full plan. As well as failing to allocate smaller sites, it fails to provide the necessary development management policies. As such, the council is thrown back on needing to rely on the old City of Derby local plan, which is nearly 2 decades old. It is painfully out of date. Relevant policies for the determination of this application still rely on policies from that plan, adopted as it was 6 years before the MPPF was published, even in its original version in 2012. The core strategy itself does not actually meet Derby's housing needs. The 647 dwellings per annum figure in the core strategy was based on 11,000 homes a year, which the identified need was 16,000. Amber Valley and South Derbyshire were meant to meet the remaining amount, I should say. The Amber Valley plan to address this need has never happened. That council is on its third go of its failed plan-making task. Derby's unmet needs proposed to be delivered in Amber Valley are going unmet, and more on this below. South Derbyshire has produced a plan, but that meets only some of Derby's unmet need. It also reveals that LPAs can produce a plan if they have strong leadership. Sadly, Derby City Council does not have that. The core strategy figure is also now woefully out of date. The core strategy figure was only good for 5 years. The standard method figure of 506 dwellings per annum now applies. Against this figure, the council has only 3.85 years supply. Far more housing sites are needed, even to get to a minimum 5-year housing land supply. It's all gone terribly wrong. The problem is the council is in denial. Councillor Matthew Holmes demonstrated beyond peradventure that he was not aware of what is really going on. He couldn't identify the scale of his own council's waiting list, or the annual affordable housing requirement based on the council's own evidence, or even how much the council is spending on temporary accommodation. He even refused to admit there is a housing crisis in this country. If you start from such an ill-informed position, there is no hope of ever appreciating the importance of an up-to-date plan addressing the housing needs of the city. No up-to-date plan, no realistic prospect of an up-to-date plan for the foreseeable future, and considerable doubt based on past record on misleading inspectors and others of ever producing a plan. As a consequence, speculative applications are necessary. They are very necessary in this case, as the council has a chronic shortfall in the minimum 5-year housing land supply requirement, added to which the delivery of affordable housing in the city has collapsed. Net delivery, with right-to-buy purchases rightly deducted, shows net loss of affordable housing in the city last year. This is why the cost of temporary accommodation has skyrocketed on an exponential growth curve. The council is in real desperate trouble, but it is the author of its own misfortune. The reason for refusal. There is only one reason for refusal. The LPA's position is that the proposal's location within the Spondon, Cheddar-ston, that should read Green Wedge, renders it in conflict with policy CP18 of the core strategy, and this, taken together with the so-called unacceptable narrowing of the Green Wedge, significantly and demonstrably outweighs any and all benefits of the proposal. The appellant will address this position in the following order. First, the appellant will set out the housing needs of this LPA. Second, it will address policy CP18 and the issues relating to this policy. Thirdly, the appellant will consider what the actual harm on the Green Wedge would be. And finally, the proposal's compliance with the core strategy and the engagement of the tilted balance under paragraph 11D of the MPPF. Starting then with housing need, obviously all of the housing policies in the development plan are out of date. They are based on the wrong housing number for a start. The development plan is not doing what it should be doing. Since 2022 and for each year since, it keeps planning for the wrong number. Policy CP6 addresses housing delivery within the core strategy's plan period. It is agreed to be out of date. This policy was adopted originally on the basis of a calculated housing requirement of 11,000 dwellings. This itself is a cap figure, since, as the core strategy remarks, the actual need figure for Derby was 16,388 dwellings. South Derbyshire District Council and Amber Valley Borough Council agreed to meet some of Derby's needs, 3,017 dwellings and 2,371 dwellings respectively. While South Derbyshire has more or less managed to meet the additional need when which it accepted to meet, Amber Valley has not managed to provide a single house to help meet Derby's needs. This is because it tried and failed several times to adopt a local plan during that period. Therefore, some 2,371 dwellings have not been delivered to meet Derby's needs. Turning to Derby's own performance on meeting its 11,000 dwelling requirement across its plan period, the LPA accepts that of that 11,000 dwellings, 851 dwellings were to be met by the adopted Part 2 of the core strategy, and as we know, Part 2 of the plan, really, the local plan. And as we all know, this Part 2 was never produced, let alone adopted. So some 851 dwellings have not been delivered to meet Derby's needs. The LPA was meant to meet an annual housing requirement of 647 dwellings per annum, and as of 2023, the LPA's housing delivery stood at just 6,779 dwellings against a requirement of 7,764 dwellings, a shortfall of 985 dwellings. As a result of all of the above, the LPA has confirmed that its development plan housing policies do not reflect the national policy position, and so the standard method is applicable in the calculation of the LPA's housing need. The LPA's housing need jumps from 647 dwellings per annum under the core strategy to 906 dwellings per annum. This increased annual housing requirement figure, coupled with the LPA's 3.85-year supply position, means it is highly unlikely, if not impossible, for the LPA to meet its housing need requirements in the next 5 years. The council are relying on a plan which is planning for the wrong number. There is a shortfall each year of 259 dwellings. Although South Derbyshire and Amber Valley are planning to meet some of the LPA's housing need, their calculations are bound to result in a shortfall, since both authorities are relying on the NPPF 2023 standard method as they fall under the transitional provisions of the NPPF. They seek to rely on the NPPF 2024 standard method figure for Derby's need, which is far lower than the housing need figure under the NPPF 23 standard method. So they are planning for the wrong number. Therefore, they are not accounting for their own increased housing need figures under the NPPF 2024 standard method, but they are accounting for Derby's decreased housing need figures. As a result, the number required in the HMA is not being met each year, and see Mr. Lee's Proof of Evidence Table 4. Consequently, it is clear not only that the LPA has a historic failure in meeting its housing needs, but its future ability to meet its needs is also compromised by all of the factors stated above, and the councils in the HMA are working to the wrong numbers. No matter how many times Councillor Holmes asserts that Derby is not alone in their failure to meet local housing need, this is simply not a defence that an LPA can adopt, as Councillor Holmes rightly accepted. More importantly, this is not a material consideration for you to give any weight to. What is a material consideration for you, sir, is how much money the LPA spends on housing those in Derby's housing register in temporary accommodation. When asked about this, Councillor Holmes accepted he didn't know what the figure was, despite being the witness nominated to defend the LPA's decision to refuse permission for a proposal which was providing 30% affordable housing. In any event, the appellant has provided this information as part of Mr. Stacey's proof of evidence, where he refers to an article dated the 24th of October 2024 by BBC News. This article reports that the LPA spent £4.6 million until September of 2024-25 financial year alone on temporary accommodation. What is perhaps even more shocking is the trajectory of the spending by the LPA on temporary accommodation in the last few years. 2021-22, 7,500, 2022-23, £360,559, 2023 to 2024, 2.6 million. 2024 to 25, until September alone, 4.6 million. This extraordinary figure spent on the LPA on temporary accommodation is a consequence of its chronic failure in meeting the affordable needs of its local population. The 2023 Derby Local Housing Needs Assessment identifies that 632 net affordable dwellings per annum will be required between 2022-23 and 2038-39. In the first year of adopting the Local Housing Needs Assessment, not only did the LPA fail to meet the 632 dwellings per annum, it in fact suffered a net loss of 77 affordable dwellings, taking into account the loss of stock through the Right to Buy scheme. Factoring this shortfall into the Local Housing Needs Assessment calculations, the LPA now needs to provide 822 net affordable homes within the next 5 years to overcome this shortfall. The LPA's latest housing land supply figure calculates a supply of 4,185 dwellings, and assuming affordable housing delivery were to continue at the average rate of 30%, this amounts to just 251 affordable dwellings per annum. This is without taking into account losses to the Right to Buy scheme. With those losses accounted for, Mr Stacey estimates that the LPA will deliver 132 net affordable dwellings, which would meet only 16% of the identified need. One can hardly begin to fathom exactly how much money will be spent on temporary accommodation if the LPA were to continue on this trajectory. But, money aside, what about those households and families that will continue to wait for a home on the housing register? If this does not symbolise a housing crisis, then the appellant is a loss as to what will. The consequences of failing to deliver affordable housing has been set out in Mr Stacey's proof of evidence. He's identified some of the main consequences of households being denied a suitable affordable home as follows: a lack of financial security and stability, poor impacts on physical and mental health, decreased social mobility, negative impacts on children's education and development, reduced safety with households forced to share facilities with those engaged in crime, antisocial behaviour and those with substance abuse issues, being housed outside social support networks, having to prioritise paying for an unaffordable rent or mortgage over basic human needs such as food, heating or eating, and increasing national housing benefit bill. We can, of course, now add to the list with the spiralling cost of temporary accommodation in Derby. The consequences of poor and unacceptable levels of affordable housing delivery have been considered by inspectors. Inspector McGlon at the Sons Place Farm Dorking appeal set out the following: the consequences of not providing enough affordable homes affects people. Being able to access good housing has a bearing upon everyday life, and there are socio-economic effects such as financial security and stability, physical and mental health, decreased social mobility, and adverse effects on children's education and development. In Mole Valley, the number of people on the housing register has risen. There are increasing affordability ratios, and people are paying significantly over 30% of their income on rent. These words of Inspector McGlon apply equally here. Policy CP18 plainly not up to date. The LPA does not have a 5-year land supply, and therefore, as per the MPPF, the most important policies for determining the application are automatically deemed out of date. This includes policy CP18, which the LPA accepts is one of the most important policies for determining the application. Therefore, how the LPA can maintain its position that CP18 is nevertheless up to date is beyond comprehension. That is the consequence of not having a 5-year housing land supply. The council seem oblivious to this. Yes, it's all been explained very clearly in the Supreme Court, in Richborough Estates and Cheshire East, Hopkins Homes and Suffolk Coastal, and you have that, sir, as CD 7.06. At the time, paragraph 49 meant only the relevant policies for the supply of housing were automatically out of date. That was the whole issue in the case. The 2018 version of the MPPF, however, ushered in a far more wide-ranging consequence for LPAs of not having a 5-year supply. It, and all subsequent versions, that's of the MPPF, make clear that all of the most important policies for determining the application will be out of date if there is no 5-year supply of housing land. This is made clear from reading paragraph 11D and footnote 8 of the MPPF. Crucially, it's not just housing policies which are out of date under the 2018 version of the MPPF and all subsequent versions. It is now other key policies which are also automatically out of date, such as green wedge policies. Incidentally, it was a green gap policy, similar to the green wedge policy here, which was the subject of the inspector's decision in the Richborough appeal. The inspector allowed an appeal in a green gap between Williston and Crewe on the basis that both countryside protection and green gap policies were out of date. The nature of that litigation is important. Richborough's planning permission for 134 houses at Williston in Cheshire was granted on appeal by Inspector Alan Boyland. It was challenged by Cheshire East Council in the High Court. The High Court judge quashed it. The Secretary of State, no doubt on the advice of his lawyers, did not seek to defend the inspector's decision any further. Richborough Estates, however, appealed to the Court of Appeal. The Court of Appeal allowed the appeal and overturned the High Court judge. The Supreme Court endorsed that decision, but for different reasons. The key point in the case was the phrase, relevant policies for the supply of housing. Richborough Estates argued for a wide interpretation of the phrase, suggesting it meant all policies which stood in the way of new housing being delivered to meet shortfall in the 5-year supply. This was to include the countryside protection and green gap policies. Cheshire East argued for a narrow one, arguing it meant just the housing policies in the plan. Crucially, when Richborough Estates got permission to appeal to the Court of Appeal from Lord Justice Sullivan, the Secretary of State applied to rejoin the litigation. The Secretary of State joined Richborough Estates in seeking the wide interpretation of the phrase, relevant policies for the supply of housing. Hopkins Holmes also joined in the litigation, arguing the same point. Lord Justice Lindblom in the Court of Appeal adopted that wide interpretation, with the other 2 Court of Appeal judges agreed. Cheshire East then applied to the Supreme Court, changed counsel favouring Mr Martin Kingston KC, who led my learned friend Mr Hugh Richards. Cheshire East was successful in arguing for the narrow interpretation of the policy, as explained in the elegant and clear judgment of Lord Carnworth. That was a rejection of the wide interpretation favoured by Richborough Estates, Hopkins Holmes and the Court of Appeal. Crucially, it was also the interpretation favoured by the Secretary of State. But whilst the Supreme Court rejected the Secretary of State's view of the wide interpretation of the phrase, relevant policies for the supply of housing, the Secretary of State has the power to rewrite the MPPF to say what he wants it to say, and so he did. And that was done in the 2018 version of the MPPF. No longer is the consequence of not having a 5-year supply simply that housing policies of the development plan are out of date. It is all of the policies which in this case are judged to be the most important for determining the application. And in this case, that includes CP18. For the record, Richborough Estate still won the case, as the court took the view, on the facts of the Richborough case, that the inspector was fully entitled to judge the green gap policy out of date in any event, as the Cheshire East local plan was time expired, past the end date of the plan. And see Lord Carnworth at paragraph 63. Hopkins Home also won, and the context of its victory is more relevant to the facts of this case, because the Supreme Court made clear that whilst the LPAs with a recently adopted plan might be surprised by this, the consequences of not having a 5-year land supply is wide-ranging. See in particular the judgment of Lord Gill, paragraphs 77, 78, 79 and 83. 77, the importance that the guidance places on boosting the supply, the guidance being the MPPF, boosting the supply of housing is further demonstrated in the same paragraph by the requirements that for market and affordable housing, planning authorities should illustrate the expected rate of housing delivery for a housing trajectory for the planned period and set out a housing implementation strategy for the full range of housing, describing how they will maintain delivery of a 5-year supply of housing to meet their housing target, and that they should set out their own approach to housing density to reflect local circumstances. And then I emphasise this, Lord Gill said, the message to planning authorities is unmistakable. Paragraph 78, these requirements and the insistence on the provision of deliverable sites sufficient to provide the 5 years' worth of housing reflect the futility of authorities relying in development plans on the allocation of sites that have no realistic prospect of being developed within the 5-year period. 79, amongst the obvious constraints on housing development are development plan policies for the preservation of the greenbelt and environmental and amenity policies and designations such as those referred to in footnote 9 of paragraph 14. The rigid enforcement of such policies may prevent a planning authority from meeting its requirement to provide a 5-year supply. And then finally, 83, if a planning authority that was in default of the requirement of a 5-year supply were to continue to apply its environmental and amenity policies with full rigour, the objective of the framework would be frustrated. The purpose of paragraph 49 is to indicate a way in which the lack of a 5-year supply of sites can be put right. It is reasonable for the guidance to suggest that in such cases the development plan policies for the supply of housing, however recent they may be, should not be considered as being up to date. CP18 is plainly one of the most important policies for determining the application. It is the only policy referred to in the single reason for refusal. The lack of a 5-year land supply means it is automatically out of date. Out of date inevitably means it should be given less weight. But that is not for some arid or academic reason. As the reasoning of Lord Gill makes clear, out-of-date policies should then be treated as less of an obstacle to the grant of permission. Their barrier effect should be reduced. The Council should not be rigidly enforcing it. The MPPF is therefore, in the words of Lord Gill, indicating to the local planning authority what they should do. They should be applying policy more flexibly, particularly for policies which are restricting housing and causing the Council not to have a 5-year supply. The 2018 and current MPPF reflects that logic perfectly. When there is no 5-year land supply, something has got to give, and in this case, it's CP18. In this case, there is absolutely no doubt the Green Wedge is doing just that. It is restricting the supply of new homes. Councillor Holmes accepted that, and rightly so. So, as it is writ large across the Green Wedge policy and the Green Wedge study. So it follows that CP18 should be given less weight, and in particular, it should not stand in the way of the permission for housing as it directly impacts on the local planning authority's ability to meet its 5-year supply. The councillors, all 3 of them, refusal to accept that CP18 is out of date is absolute, and it's unreasonable. This confusion is further exacerbated by the fact the LPA rightly and readily accept that policy CP6, which is another of the most important policies for determining the application, is out of date as a result of the housing land supply position. Yet the Council cannot make the same concession for policy CP18. When questioned on this, Councillor Holmes was at pains to assert that policy CP18 is relevant and very important. The appellant does not dispute the relevance of CP18, but whether or not it's up to date for the purpose of decision-making is an entirely different concept, which the LPA and their witness failed to grasp. Having spent 2 days of this inquiry, the inquiry is yet to be provided with a reason for the stance which it is in direct conflict with nationally adopted policy in the form of paragraph 11 of the MPPF. Although Councillor Holmes and the other 2 councillors who spoke at the inquiry repeatedly asserted the importance of abiding by local policies adopted by democratically elected councils, one should not forget that national planning policy is also adopted by a democratically elected national government. The officer's report at 7.2, the second paragraph, is wrong on this point. Officers failed to recognise the policy is automatically out of date. The appellant notes, however, that not only is the LPA's position untenable, the LPA has not pursued the point in cross-examination. Mr. Richards, in his cross-examination of Mr. Lees, put to him that the LPA has misdirected the policy as being up to date, misdescribed the policy as being up to date. He went on to suggest that, nevertheless, that didn't affect the officer's advice to the planning committee. It was not suggested to Mr. Lees that the policy was up to date and not out of date, and rightly so, as that would be plainly wrong. All three councillors who spoke at the inquiry, including Councillor Holmes, who was the sole witness to give evidence on behalf of the LPA, assert that policy CP18 was up to date. Therefore, it now remains unclear if the LPA agrees with the appellant or not, and plainly to change their position on whether CP18 is up to date on day 2 of a 3-day inquiry would be unreasonable in any event. The council are now in an impossible position, and that is because their position is unreasonable. The councils have brought the cost application entirely upon themselves because they repeat political mantra about policy CP18 being up to date without understanding how the MPPF works. They have misunderstood and misinterpreted the MPPF on the single key issue in the case, and therefore the appellant has a cast iron case on costs. For the record, a policy's consistency with the MPPF does not make an out-of-date policy up to date again. The lack of a 5-year land supply makes the policy out of date, and in any event, as Mr. Lees made clear, CP18 is not consistent with national policy. Firstly, there is no national policy for green wedges, so it plainly can't be consistent with it. And secondly, to the extent it seeks to exclude housing development altogether, it's not consistent with the aims and objectives of the MPPF. But none of that matters. The whole point is the first part of 11D is to say CP18 is out of date, so it becomes much easier to grant planning permission so that the 5-year land supply shortfall might be addressed. But for the record, CP18 is out of date, not only due to the LPA's housing land supply position, but also because it's actually in conflict with the MPPF. As Mr. Lees described, CP18 is protectionist and binary in that housing is plainly not one of the types of development which it permits within green wedges. There are a number of criteria within CP18, but criteria A is very straightforward in stating the LPA will ensure that development in the green wedges is limited to, emphasis added, the types set out under criteria A. The LPA's council attempted to argue that criterion B, in fact, allows for other types of development too, and not only those listed in A. Firstly, this is disputed for reasons already stated above. However, even if one were to accept this proposition, the fact is there is no analysis whatsoever, either in the committee minutes or in Councillor Holmes' proof of evidence, as to whether the proposal complies or contradicts with criterion B of the CP18. Indeed, the LPA's statement of case plainly states that the proposal is residential and so not included in the list of appropriate development in the green wedges. Ergo, it conflicts with policy CP18. Therefore, even if the LPA's council was right in its interpretation of policy CP18B, the fact is that it was applied far too rigidly by the LPA's planning committee in their assessment of the proposal. The LPA seek to rely on the Acorn Way appeal to demonstrate that an inspector did find policy CP18 to play an important function and remain consistent with the MPPF. Firstly, this was a decision from 2016, and there have obviously been material changes in terms of housing land supply, the need for and definition of affordable housing, amended by the 2018 MPPF and retained in subsequent revisions, and the wider national policy since 2016. Secondly, the inspector made his decision on the Acorn Way appeal prior to policy CP18 actually being adopted. Therefore, he would have been unaware of the LPA's commitment to the local plan examining inspector to bring non-strategic housing forward as part 2 of the core strategy and to review green wedges by December 2017. Thirdly, the part 2 plan, which was promised, was never progressed. So what we now know is that the promised further review of the Green Wedge, which was required by the core strategy plan to be found sound, was not done. It's fair to say the inspector in that case was not considering the 2018 or subsequent version of the MPPF. It is now plain as a pikestaff that the consequence of not having a 5-year land supply means CP18 is automatically out of date. The courts have time and again reminded us that relevant local plan policies may have been overtaken by other things since the adoption, either on the ground or in some change in national policy. The MPPF, being national policy, has undisputedly changed since the adoption of CP18 back in 2017. MPPF 2024 and this new national government's intention on boosting housing across the country, including on greenfield land, is well established and acknowledged. Therefore, in a climate where national policies and priorities have shifted such that greenfield land need no longer be protected from housing development for the sake of being greenfield land, this must be a material change in national policy since the adoption of CP18. The appellant does not dispute that the principle of green wedges is not necessarily inconsistent with the MPPF. However, it is the construction and wording of policy CP18 and its overly rigid application by the LPA, which the appellant asserts is in conflict with the MPPF. Actually, just to amend that, we do say it is inconsistent with the MPPF, actually. So delete not necessarily. The principle of green wedges is inconsistent with the MPPF. Because that's the corollary of what I said earlier and Mr. Lee's evidence. The weight to be given to conflict with CP18 is ultimately a matter for you. However, as the Supreme Court has warned, where an LPA is in default of its 5-year housing land supply requirement, it would frustrate the objective of the MPPF if one were to continue applying out-of-date policies with full rigour. Therefore, given that policy CP18 is out of date, any conflict with it must be given limited weight, since to do so otherwise would be to frustrate the objective of paragraph 11D of the MPPF. The LPA's counsel's attempt to argue that somehow LPA officers recommended on giving weight to the policy CP18 is not materially affected by the claim that CP18 is up to date. However, the LPA's officers did not specify what weight should be given to CP18 and only that weight should be given, referencing the consistency of Policy 18 and its up-to-date status. Clearly, this very approach is wrong. The consistency with the MPPF issue contained in paragraph 232 of the MPPF is relevant when there is a 5-year supply of housing land, but the decision maker then needs to ask him or herself whether the most important policies in the development plan are out of date. This was the issue in Wavendon Properties and the Secretary of State in Milton Keynes. And for your notes, sir, that is CD 7.03. Wavendon Properties, this involves detailed consideration of each relevant policy in the plan, judging if it is one of the most important for determining the application, and then assessing it against the MPPF to decide if it is inconsistent with the MPPF in any event. It is a very burdensome task. But if there is no 5-year land supply, then there is no need to go through that complicated task to answer the question of whether the most important policies for determining the application are out of date. Paragraph 11D of the MPPF does that for the decision maker. Turning to CP18 and the relationship with housing, one shouldn't forget that policy CP18 was adopted on the basis of a green wedge review conducted in 2012, over a decade ago. This policy, as Councillor Holmes accepted, envisaged that urban extensions can take place within the green wedge, and where they do, the principle of the green wedge is to be maintained. Indeed, the supporting text of CP18 at paragraph 5.18.6 notes that the green wedge boundaries will be considered further under a Part 2 of the core strategy in order to identify sites for non-strategic housing. This paragraph was inserted as one of the main modifications requested by the inspector presiding over the local plan examination in 2016, where the inspector notes that policy CP18 provides an appropriate basis for the consideration of development proposals, and I quote, in the context of the commitment to consider whether boundaries should be amended to allocate further housing sites. Councillor Holmes accepted that the LPA's commitment to the inspector that a Part 2 of the core strategy will come forward around December 2017, part of which will consider a review of the green wedges. But to this date, no Part 2 has come forward. So no green wedge review was undertaken, no allocations for non-strategic housing sites were made, and CP18 remains frozen in time as at the point of adoption. This only further adds to the conclusion that policy CP18 has failed to keep up with the changes in housing needs and local circumstances, and due to none other than the LPA's own inability to bring forward a Part 2 of its core strategy. Councillor Holmes accepted that there is a symbiotic relationship between green wedges and housing, since the policy itself envisages urban extensions to take place within green wedges, and Councillor Holmes accepted this too. Indeed, the Green Wedge Review 2012 was not shy in concluding explicitly that green wedge boundaries will be subject to change in the future depending on final calculations for housing need. Further, as the LPA themselves pointed out during Mr. Lee's oral evidence, the Derby Housing Land Capacity Paper from October of last year, prepared by officers at the council, asserts that one of the sources for potential new capacity for housing are green wedges, with 615 dwellings expected to come forward on green wedges. Where these sites are and how they will be brought forward, no one, including the LPA, seems to know. However, the fact is that on the LPA's own evidence, housing on green wedges is an inevitability. This makes the LPA's position to refuse this proposal on the sole basis that it's located within the green wedge all the more unreasonable. The difference between the LPA and the appellant is that the former remains steadfast in their view that the process of allowing housing for green wedges is one that must take place in the context of a local plan. However, it is the LPA's responsibility to bring forward an up-to-date local plan, or at the very least a Part 2 for the core strategy, which was promised at the local plan examination in 2016. Having reneged on their commitment to bring forward a Part 2 to the core strategy, the LPA are now surprised as to why non-strategic sites for housing, such as this one here, are being brought forward as windfall development on green wedges instead of being designed as part of the local plan. To put it simply, where there is no up-to-date local plan that makes allocations for non-strategic housing sites nor a green wedge review since 2012, it is almost inevitable that such a proposal will come forward outside of the local plan process. The LPA was at pains to point out the work that was undertaken for a new emerging local plan, but as Councillor Holmes rightly accepted in the end, you, sir, can give no weight to an emerging local plan that has not only not reached the Regulation 19 or 18 stages, but has not even been published to the public. Although the LPA claim that the first draft will come forward in autumn 2025 with the national government's pending guidance on the new local plan examination system and the possibility for overlap with any new national development management policies, this timeline looks increasingly unrealistic. Moreover, as the Council accepted, their track record on bringing forward local plans is relevant in ascertaining how credible their claims for the timeline for a new emerging local plan are. Their record is clearly poor, having failed to bring forward a Part 2 to the core strategy and failing to conduct a green wedge review for over a decade. Impact on the Spondon-Chaddeston green wedge. Councillor Holmes accepted on behalf of the LPA that the Criterion K of Policy CP18 envisages that urban extensions can take place within the green wedge, and where they do, the principle of the green wedge is to be maintained. Councillor Holmes also accepted that if the proposal was to proceed, the principle of the green wedge will be maintained, albeit the green wedge will be physically narrowed as a result of the proposal, thereby affecting the function of the green wedge. It is at this last point that the two parties differ. The appellant avers that the proposal will not adversely impact the function of the green wedge for several reasons. Firstly, the appeal site is located within the eastern element of the green wedge, directly adjoining the settlement of Spondon. As Mrs. Ellensfield described, the western boundary of the green wedge is noticeably different in character to the eastern boundary, since the former is defined by consistent vegetation along Acorn Way, which itself is bound by hedgerows and trees on both sides, whereas the eastern boundary has a more varied relationship with the edge of Spondon. The western element of the green wedge is made up of a field pattern which is more open, and the scale of fields within this element is visually different to that in the eastern element, as the latter is made up of smaller fields. There is a variety of developments surrounding the appeal site within the eastern element of the green wedge. So the east of Spondon settlement, to the east is Spondon settlement, to the south is the Springfield Primary School, to the north there is the water tower forming part of the reservoir compound, and to the west there is a cluster of farm buildings. Farm buildings, can you add there please, including commercial operations such as the Catterian Kennels, and a whole series of non-agricultural horse-related activity. This relationship of built development is within the eastern element surrounding the appeal site is markedly different to the western element of the green wedge, given the openness forms a part of the characteristic and function of the green wedge, taking into account the above. Mrs. Ellensfield logically concludes that the western element of the green wedge plays a more significant role in the function of the green wedge as opposed to the eastern element where the appeal site is located. This conclusion is also supported by the 2012 Green Wedge Review. Secondly, Mrs. Ellensfield in her proof sets out at length her understanding and application of the Eastleigh criteria, a well-established set of criteria arising out of the 1998 Eastleigh Local Plan to determine the effectiveness of strategic gaps and green wedges. As a result of applying this criteria, she concludes that the appeal site relates more closely to the smaller scale fields within the urban edge land adjoining Spondon rather than the larger and typically agricultural fields observed within much of the green wedge to the west. As a result, she concludes that the appeal site does not lie within an area of high sensitivity in terms of its contribution to the function of the green wedge. Thirdly, the proposal will not push development any further west than already exists at the narrowest part of the green wedge. As Mrs. Ellensfield described, the current narrowest part of the green wedge is between the residential development on West Road and Acorn Way, which lies southwest of the appeal site, and the proposal will not fall within this gap. The distance of this gap is around 295 metres. If the proposal were to be developed, the distance between the development and the western edge of the green gap will be between 287 and 335 metres, varying at various parts of the proposal due to the site layout. Therefore, even the narrowest part between the proposed development and the western edge will be 287 metres, which is approximately a 3% decrease in width compared with what exists currently between the residential development on West Road and the western edge of the green wedge, i.e. Acorn Way. This is what the LPA allege amounts to an unacceptable narrowing of the green wedge, a 3% decrease in width, and that too only at the narrowest point between the development and the western edge of the green wedge. It's worth highlighting here that the LPA's planning officers agreed with the appellant's position that the function of the green wedge is not impacted given the existing development on West Road. The appellant's case is not that just because there is a lack of 5-year land supply, all green wedge land must be released for development. Rather, it is that this particular site has specific characteristics which make it one of the more suitable sites within a green wedge. This is best highlighted by comparing the Acorn Way appeal site to the current appeal site. The LPA rely heavily on the inspector's conclusions from the Acorn Way appeal as to the impact of the proposal in that appeal on the green wedge. However, some key distinctions need to be drawn between Acorn Way appeal site and the appeal site here. Firstly, the Acorn Way appeal proposal was proposed on a site in the southwest corner of the green wedge adjoining Acorn Way. As already set out, the western element of the green wedge in its western boundary is of higher sensitivity and performs a more significant role to the function of the green wedge than the eastern element where this appeal site is located. Therefore, the sheer location of the Acorn Way appeal site within the green wedge was problematic. Secondly, the Acorn Way appeal decision would have had to breach that distinct vegetative line boundary due to the type of boundary that exists on the western edge of the green wedge. Thirdly, the visual influence of this proposal has limited, if any, contribution to intervisibility or intravisibility with regards to Spondon and Chaddeston, and this is due to the robust buffer scheme offered as part of this proposal and sensitively designed layout of the proposal and its location adjoining the Spondon settlement edge to the east of the green wedge. Finally, the sheer size of the Acorn Way appeal scheme was significantly greater than the current proposal. Going back to the point that the appeal site is surrounded by development on all four sides, the LPA accept that such sites within the green wedge are few and far between. Further, Mrs. Ellenfield highlighted the unique feature of the appeal site in being surrounded by development on all four sides and how the water tower and reservoir compound to the north of the appeal site visually already narrow the perception of the green wedge. Although the LPA attempted to compare the appeal site to another one within the LPA's area, which has development on all four sides, which is currently in the planning application process, Mr. Lees explained how this site could not be compared with the appeal site since the proposal on the other site would cut off the connection between the green wedge and the countryside, thus negatively impacting the function of the green wedge, which is not the case with the proposal. The 2012 Green Wedge Review identifies at paragraph 1912 that whilst development within the green wedges will have an impact upon their openness and undeveloped character, it could provide an opportunity to make improvements and enhancements. The review sets out a number of potential enhancements that could be brought forward as part of new development. Mr. Leeds was taken through a number of these and his conclusions are as follows. Open up public access to retaining areas of green wedge and improve existing routes, pathways and cycle paths. The proposal provides new open space and amenity space along with new and enhanced pedestrian and cycle paths. Provide new recreational spaces and facilities, same as the above. Remove scruffy areas of land. The site currently has a horticulture use with a variety of stables and fences, and the site looks unkempt. So yes, the site is currently scruffy. Provide greater variation of uses within the greenbelt, helping to improve biodiversity. We are providing biodiversity net gain. Provide opportunities to implement sustainable drainage systems utilising existing streams and ditch systems. The proposal will make use of such systems. Provide opportunities for local food production and community gardening. The proposal consists of the provision of an orchard. Improve community awareness of the role and function of the green wedge. Existing contributions could be used to put up signage and inform members of the public of the footpath. Therefore, although it's accepted that the proposal will inevitably have some impact on the green wedge, not only will the function and principle of the green wedge be maintained, but also a number of potential enhancements can be made to the appeal site. Other landscape and visual amenity matters. The LPA have repeatedly insisted at this inquiry that they take no issue with any wider landscape and visual amenity impacts of the proposal. Nevertheless, the LPA feels compelled to highlight the efforts to take and to design this proposal in a manner which seeks to minimise as much as possible the landscape and visual amenity impacts of the proposal.
The restriction of the amount of built development on site, and that too to only specific areas within the site, was done to make the most of the topography of the appeal site to ensure that any perceived changes to the character are restricted and highly localised. The green infrastructure framework proposed is an inherent part of the proposal, with a strengthened landscape buffer along the western edge to reinforce boundary between the appeal site and the agricultural landscape to the west. Points raised by third parties have been dealt with by Mr. Lees as Section 8 of his proof of evidence. A particular matter raised in the inquiry was issues relating to highways. The appellant points to BWP Consulting's comments on highway issues and the fact that the LPA as highway authority have not objected to the proposal, provided the necessary conditions are imposed. Planning balance. Section 38(6) of the Planning and Compulsory Purchase Act and Section 70 of the Town and Country Planning Act require that planning decisions be made in accordance with the local plan unless material considerations indicate otherwise. This is the statutory presumption in favour of the development plan. However, one of those other material considerations is the MPPF. Paragraph 11D of the MPPF contains the tilted balance. It makes clear that where the most important policies to determine the application are out of date, then permission should be granted unless adverse impacts of doing so would significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits of the proposal, having regard to the MPPF as a whole and in particular some specific policies. Both parties accept the tilted balance is engaged in this appeal, but before proceeding to assess the benefits and harms of the proposal and how they affect the balance, it's important to highlight the overwhelming compliance of the proposal with the core strategy as is. The proposal complies with local plan policies on sustainable development, CP1A, climate change, CP2, placemaking principles, CP3, character and context, CP4, affordable and specialist housing, CP7, green infrastructure, CP16, public green space, CP17, biodiversity, CP18, and policy MH1, making it happen. The proposals also comply with the following saved policies of the City of Derby local plan: amenity, GD5, residential development, general criteria, H13, pollution, E12, community safety, E24, access for disabled people, T10, and protection of footpaths, cycleways and routes for horses, T15. The only policy conflict identified by the LPA is the conflict with CP18, which they argue is such an overwhelming conflict that it is on its own significantly and demonstrably outweighs any or all of the benefits of the proposal. With that in mind, we set out the list of benefits offered by the proposal as against the single harm identified by the LPA. Benefits. The proposal's provision of up to 90 dwellings within 5 years in the face of the LPA's abject failure to meet its housing needs attracts very significant positive weight, and this is agreed by the LPA. This benefit must also be viewed in light of the fact that the appellant Miller Homes plans to commence development on the site in 2026 with a forecast 30 dwellings completed by 2027 and 30 per annum in the subsequent 2 years. There's often an argument made that planning permission granted doesn't mean the houses get built. However, Miller Homes are content for the approval to be conditioned or reserved matters applications being made within 6 months of the grant of this outline permission and for the commencement of development to be required within 18 months of the final reserved matter approval. The proposal offers 30% affordable housing units, with 80% of those being social rented and 20% being shared ownership, in line with the Council's identified needs. This is a key benefit when the LPA's position on affordable housing within its jurisdiction is as poor as it is, and so this is a benefit that would attract very significant positive weight, and this is agreed by the LPA. The illustrative proposals consist of 2.22 hectares of amenity green space, with a commitment to deliver at least 2 hectares via planning condition, which is in excess of the local policy CP17, the planning obligations SPD requirement of 0.3 hectares. The proposal also provides a local equipped area of play that will be accessible to existing nearby children. The new open space areas will be delivered with new and enhanced pedestrian and cycling linkages, all of which currently do not exist on the appeal site, given that it currently comprises of small field enclosures and paddocks used for grazing and no public rights of way across the appeal site. There are clearly benefits for the wider community and as such should attract at least moderate positive weight, although Councillor Holmes accepted that very significant weight should be given to this. The proposal will give rise to numerous economic benefits at the construction stage with an estimated £17.3 million investment over a 24-month build programme, 137 direct and indirect jobs generated during the build phase and 16.3 million gross value added economic output contribution. At the operational stage, 103 economically active and employed residents are estimated to be living on the site, with 49% estimated to be working in higher value, higher income occupations, with 576,000 estimated first occupation expenditures, an estimated 180,820 annual increase in council tax revenue, and a 2.5 million annual household expenditure. These are all benefits that Mr. Lees concludes attract moderate positive weight. The sustainable location of the appeal site is demonstrated by the existence of a large number of facilities, including schools, recreational areas, doctors' surgeries, food stores and employment centres within a 10-minute walk from the appeal site. This should be taken together with the sustainable transport modes which are prioritised by the proposal in that new and enhanced walking and cycling paths are to be provided as part of the proposal, and a financial contribution is to be made for a new bus service. These factors should be given moderate positive weight. The proposal also offers biodiversity net gain of 11.31% for habitats, 32.25% for hedgerows, and 78.09% for watercourses. This is a benefit which attracts moderate positive weight, given that Regulation 3 requiring minimum biodiversity gains do not apply in relation to this proposal. The proposal makes effective use of land while securing a well-designed scheme, which is demonstrated by the landscape-sensitive design that has been carried out in ascertaining the illustrative layout of the appeal site. The proposal seeks to provide family homes with gardens, which is reflective of the character of Spondon. 2 hectares of an appeal site is set out to remain open space, and in the remaining area within the appeal site, the proposal seeks to achieve a 40 dwelling per hectare density. Can I just add there, sir, when paragraph 130 of the MPPF, when there's a shortfall of land, decisions have to be taken in the context of optimising the use of the land. So for the development parcels at 40 dwellings per hectare density, we are optimising. That's particularly when there's no fibre land supply. This approach has been taken to be sensitive and sympathetic to the local character. This is undoubtedly one of the reasons why the LPA take no issue with the landscape and visual amenity impacts of the proposals, as they repeatedly remind the inquiry. The proposal's approach to achieve well-designed places and make effective use of land should attract moderate positive weight. Harms. The appellant accepts that the proposal is in conflict with CP18 in that it proposes residential development within a green wedge. However, this conflict must attract limited weight for 2 reasons. 1, policy CP18 is out of date, and 2, the actual harm to the function of the green wedge is at best limited for the reasons already set out above. The appellant accepts that due to the fact the development is proposed on greenfield land, there will be some landscape and visual amenity impacts. However, these will be minimal and limited due to the proposed layout, including the retention and enhancement of tree cover, hedgerow features, and restricting the areas of built form within the appeal site. Councillor Holmes accepted that the appellant has done what it can to minimise the impacts of the proposal. Turning to the tilted balance. As has been accepted by all parties, the tilted balance as paragraph 11D of the MPPF applies, so planning permission should be granted unless adverse impacts significantly demonstrably outweigh the benefits of the scheme, having particular regard to key policies within the MPPF. These are the footnote 9 policies. The proposals comply with all of the relevant footnote 9 policies, and in order to avoid repetition of the above, the position is summarised as follows. It provides 30% affordable housing, compliant with paragraph 66 of the MPPF. The site is within a sustainable location and promotes sustainable modes of transport, compliant with paragraph 110 and 115 of the NPPF. The proposal makes effective use of land, compliant with paragraph 129 of the NPPF, and the proposal clearly complies with good design principles and is sympathetic to the local character, compliant to paragraph 135 and 139 of the NPPF. And for all the reasons above, you are asked to allow the appeal and grant planning permission. Now, if I may just briefly, I've just got a couple of observations on Malone Friends closing submissions. I've obviously tried to anticipate them. Firstly, can I just ask you to go to paragraph 7, and there's a suggestion that we came close to asserting it's grey wedge. I don't remember that, and there's no such thing, and that's not our case. Next, can I ask you to look at paragraph 9, the end of which refers to this conclusion in the green wedge study. This green wedge is not considered to have any potential capacity for new development from a green wedge perspective. It only analysed the Acorn Way site. It did not look at any other site, and in particular, it didn't look at this site. So that conclusion has no evidential value. It is completely and utterly false, and one wonders why it's there. Possibly it's politically motivated, I don't know. But you can't focus your analysis on one area, look at it, reject it, the Acorn Way site, and then say, well, the rest of the gap isn't suitable either, when you haven't looked at the rest of the gap, and in particular, you haven't looked at individual parcels. How on earth was that conclusion arrived at? Paragraph 10, we get the quote from the inspector about the green wedges serving an important function, etc., etc. His conclusions there are all in the context of a site which is the nearest bit of the green wedge for all of the residents in the main part of Derby. That was their nearest bit of green wedge. That is not the position with us. We're next to the residents of Spondon, who only have to go about 50 metres beyond our site on existing footpaths to arrive at the green wedge. In fact, the green wedge is exactly where it is in terms of the 300 metres, and the wider countryside, which is protected by a green belt, all of that is in exactly the same place. The residents of Spondon have open space all around them. Therefore, the Acorn Way, being the nearest bit for all the residents of Derby, particularly the eastern side of Derby, is completely different in terms of its function. And of course, the inspector was writing up his conclusions, Mr. Cullingworth, lecturer at Newcastle University, as well as being a planning inspector, was writing up his views in the context of refusing the permission, the local plan just about to be adopted. So the democratic process, a Greenbelt review having been conducted in 2012, and all of which reinforces a plan-led system. Now, 13 years after that review, we're very much in a non-plan-led system. Over the page, at the top of page 11, the psychological and physical break between Chaddeston and Spondon, that will remain. There will remain a psychological and physical break. Paragraph 13, CP18 can be given full weight for consistency. You don't break up the weight you give to a policy into different components. We've said it's inconsistent with the NPPF anyway, but it doesn't matter. It's already out of date. And so that's the crucial consideration. I don't see how you can attribute full weight to consistency, but reduced weight because it's out of date. You've got to reach a view about that policy. And paragraph 11D and footnote 8 tell you precisely what to do. Treat it as out of date, and it must follow that it's reduced weight. Paragraph 14 penultimate line, basket, that is not the right test. The basket applies to the Wavendon case, Mr. Justice Dove, referring to what's called the Wavendon basket. That's the process when there is a 5-year land supply, and then you put the policies that are most important policies, you work those out. I explained it in the closing submissions. The phrase basket does not apply to an 11D situation, and it's really important not to get those two cases confused. Paragraph 17, suggestions that are not relevant to the green wedge are a series of Mrs. Ellensfield's conclusions. Well, the most elevated parts of the appeal site, that plainly is relevant because the position of the school and the size of the school buildings have a more imposing impact on the gap than would do our development. Their physical presence and their topographical location will be relevant to their impact on the gap. B, reinforces the narrower nature of the gap. The wedge is an area of separation penetrating in 13 locations into the urban area of Derby. There will remain a wedge penetrating into the urban area of Derby. And so it's not a question of saying, well, it makes it narrower. It doesn't make it narrower. My learned friend said he wasn't taking the point about the 8-metre difference. It's no narrower than it already is. Paragraph E, my learned friend, if I may say so, very fairly addresses the axis point, which I haven't done, but that is a very accurate summary, if I may say so, that the axis is the most sensitive part and we're not on it. Contrast the hollow, well, I finally worked out where that was. The hollow is absolutely slap bang in the middle of the axis and would absolutely close off the wedge. Chalk and cheese. 16, development in all 4 directions. And it's suggested then that, well, that happens with lots of the wedge. You get development in all 4 directions. Not all of it, obviously, because the wedge has got to come from somewhere. It would be if you closed it off at the hollow. But we need to be absolutely clear. Development in all 4 directions in close proximity to the site. In close proximity to the site. If you look at what the council is saying, you know, well, all of the green wedge is in close, had development in 4 sides. A, not correct, because it can't be on one side. But even if you accept that, some of the gaps they're talking about to the nearest residential development are like 300, 400, 500 metres away. So it's not that we're talking about. What we're talking about is development on all 4 sides in close proximity to the site. And at the bottom, my learned friend uses the phrase at the bottom of the page, built countryside. No, Mrs. Ellensfield made absolutely clear she did not say it's built countryside, because built countryside isn't countryside. Developed countryside, a phrase used by other inspectors, acknowledges something is countryside, but there is built development around it. As I put to the councillor, the opposite of which is deep countryside, when you don't have any urban features there. And she was clear about that. Nearly there. My learned friend at paragraph 19, reigniting the precedent argument at the bottom of his paragraph 19. Not a reason for refusal in this case. It clearly should have been stated if it was, that it creates a precedent for all the reasons we've addressed in closing submissions, and particularly the unique nature of the site. It doesn't set a precedent at all. That was the concern that Mr. Cullingworth had. Again, there was soon to be a new local plan following a recently considered Greenbelt review, not remotely similar circumstances to where we are now. Paragraph 23, I simply say about all of paragraph 23, none of that work is in the public domain. We can't comment on the detail of all of that. But in any event, what weight can you give to the evidence base of a document that hasn't even been published? And the answer is you can't. It does conclude, of course, at point 8 with the magical 615 dwellings that are coming out of the green wedge. Well, it was odd, wasn't it, that that wasn't provided, because we're very obviously in that list. The council are aware of this site. The officers recommended approval. It will be the officers who've recommended the 615. I specifically challenged the councillor to say there is no better site in the Derby Green Wedge than this one to develop, and no attempt was made to disclose that report or suggest elsewhere. We're in that report. They just won't disclose it. Why else wouldn't they disclose it? 25, the council say they won't pursue a plan under the new regime. We have absolutely no idea. That would provide another excellent reason for delay. Well, we're just waiting for the new system whenever that comes out. No weight can be given to the idea they're going to proceed. Everybody's been rushing to get their Regulation 18 and 19 versions in by the 19th of March. We've seen absolutely nothing from Derby. And then the suggestion at the end of paragraph 25, there's a sense of urgency. Well, that is laced with irony for a council that promised a Part 2 plan 7 years ago. Their idea of urgency is glacial. And finally, at paragraph 20, the appellant seems content that there will be some left. Some left? 29. Some left. 300 metres left. 300 metres of wide open agricultural fields with strong boundaries either side and no narrower than the wedge that the council already seek to rely upon. So thank you for allowing me to do that on top of the closing submissions.
Just for record keeping, in terms of the document reference, 12.11 for the closing statement and 12.12 for the written cost application that I now have before me. So when it comes to the council for a response on that in terms of time frame.
I'm not going to be able to, as for that response today. I need to take instructions on it. I need to do some research. I would, because of, as I indicated to you, I at least of the whole thing. I wouldn't ask for 3 weeks today.
So that'll be the 8th of May. So you haven't got any thoughts on that?
I do, but I'd probably best keep them to myself. Look, it's an important issue. We all understand that. I would have thought 2 weeks was fine.
Well, I could suggest the second, Friday the 2nd, so you've got the whole of the next week when you're back from your leave.
We'll do it.
I get.
Some work can go on here while I'm away.
I then need to do a reply.
That would be 5 working days from then. Would that be realistic?
So my Linford has till the 25th. Is that right?
2nd.
22nd.
No, 2nd.
Oh,
2nd of May.
2nd, sorry. I was changing it for him.
Well, the 5th is a bank holiday, I believe, isn't it? So.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fine. No, I'm going to say the 6th because I don't think I'll need to say very much. I'm going to say the 6th, so it doesn't delay you.
For a change.
Yeah, quicker than normal. Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I was just reading some messages.
Okay, well, the 2nd for cost response and the final rebuttal, if any, by the 6th of May for the appellant side. Okay.
Yeah.
In terms of the revised 106, we got to a point where we've got a draft. Thank you.
Well done.
Right. Okay. Okay, so I've been provided with a track changes version.
Yeah, it sounds sensible, though we can all see well.
Yeah.
Could we go through it now? I know that's tedious, but it's much better than trying to do it by correspondence.
I was going to ask if someone, I don't know who wants to take the lead on doing that. So perhaps I'll just start on some of the notes that I made in terms of the key changes that were going to be made.
Are you happy to continue, or do you want a break?
Yeah, perhaps it might be sensible to take 10 minutes.
That's exactly what Mr. Lee said, yeah. Reading your mind.
Yeah, okay. Let's have a quick 10-minute adjournment. We'll come back, 1:10.
Oh, yeah. And then look, take look, we will send it.
But can you send electronic as well?
Tutorial will send it to you.
Can you send electronic?
Okay, so just to go through track changes in the latest draft of the legal agreement. I think from my initial reading, this seems to reflect what we discussed earlier today. From my initial read, I've just a couple of potential typos, I guess. At 5.1.1, it says to observe and perform the obligations. I think it's in part 3 of each of Schedule 2 and Schedule 4, rather than Schedule 2 to Schedule 1. I think it's only Schedules 2 and 4 that have obligations for the council. There's one more very minor thing. I think it seems to make sense, the education amendments. Just the paragraph 2.1 in Schedule 4. There's catchment primary school and catchment secondary school. I just think they should be plurals to realign with the definitions given at the start of the schedule. Is there anything else anyone wanted to raise or question anything? I assume it's fully agreed between the two parties.
Yes, we have.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. I might have, if it's acceptable, not going to delay the end of the inquiry, but I might just have another read through this afternoon, and if I did come up with anything further, just to send a note through.
Yes.
Just
absolutely.
before you commence doing whatever you need to do to get signatures and whatever else.
Yep, okay, that's very helpful indeed, thank you.
And we would both like to ask you for a date of the 2nd of May. Copy of the sign.
Yeah, well, that's aligns with the other date that's been given, so
That's what we thought.
I'm happy with that, yeah. No confusion. Yeah, and that's fully completed, sealed, and ready to go. Okay. Yeah, I'm happy with that. And yes, just to reconfirm, the only other action for myself in terms of visiting the site on a day once we're open again after the Easter recess. Yeah. And so that will occur, as we said, with me focusing on traffic and parking impacts or circumstances. Are there any other final points of clarification, procedure, or anything before we close?
Very much.
Okay. Just remains to say thank you everyone for their contributions. The inquiry is now closed.
Thank you.